Hey guys, we're going to talk about the table saw today. We do a lot of different stuff on the table saw, so there's actually quite a bit to go over as far as safety goes. We've got this SawStop table saw, and then we've got that Powermatic table saw over there. Most of our ripping, cross-cutting, if we're going to tilt the blade and cut a bevel, most of that sort of stuff we're going to do on this one, and mostly on that one we just cut dados with it. We'll just start going through the rules. Number one, we're going to observe a 4-inch safety margin. Okay, that's the same as the joiner, 4 inches. So basically, anytime my hand is going to be within 4 inches of the blade, I'm going to need to use a push stick so I don't put my hand in danger. Number two, never freehand stock on the table saw. And maybe you're not sure what freehanding is, but basically, freehanding is not using a fence. It's not using a miter gauge. It's basically just drawing a line on your board, drawing a line on there, and just kind of just eyeballing it basically. The reason why we can't freehand is this is a pretty long blade, and it's traveling. It's rotating this way, and so if we're cutting through there and we bind just a little bit of tension binding on there, it's going to try and throw that board back at us. So that's why it's real dangerous. Number three, we're going to raise the blade where it protrudes 1/4 of an inch above the stock. Okay, so we're going to put our board there. In the middle over here, there's a little knob in the middle we're going to loosen, and then a big crank, and we're going to crank that up or down. So it's 1/4 of an inch. Now, 1/4 of an inch is kind of the measurement for the test. Really, we want to get to about the bottom of what they call the gullet. About a tooth, basically, is what we're saying. We want to be about a tooth above the stock. All right, use the blade guard unless it obscures or hinders the cutting action. So we don't have the guard on right now. If I have to cut a little skinny piece, like a 1/2 inch, that guard is going to be in the way. I'm not going to be able to safely run that through there. And so I wouldn't want to have it on then. I think basically anything under about 1.5 inches, the guard's going to be in the way. So anything 1.5 inches up, we ought to be able to use the guard on. Also, if we're cross-cutting with our big cross-cutting sled, the guard doesn't allow that thing to travel the way it needs to, and so that hinders the cutting action, so we wouldn't use it then. Number five, when 2 people are operating the table saw, the person in feeding should be in control and doing most of the pushing. The person out feeding is basically just catching, supporting the wood. We've got a real nice table saw here. Big setup. We can actually, we made it big, deep enough that we can rip a whole sheet of plywood without it tipping off of there by yourself. It's real handy. So having 2 people is not critical, but it is handy. So if I'm cutting boards, if I'm cutting this board through there and I'm making multiple cuts, it is nice for that person to catch my boards as they come out. And also this scrap, the scrap piece that comes off when I rip, I don't want to reach past that blade to go grab that. So it is handy when the person on that side can go ahead and pull that piece out of the way for me. But what we don't want is we don't want that person to pull your board through while you're ripping. And I'm going to show you why. Ripping this board, my left hand's pushing the board up against the fence, staying tight. So I'm pushing that board through, pushing it through, pushing it through, pushing it through. And then I have to pause to grab my push stick to finish this cut. Okay? Well, if the person on that end is pulling the board, and so I'm pushing this through, while I'm looking over here trying to get my push stick, they're pulling that board, they're going to be pulling my hand right into the blade. So it's not helpful. And I'd say while you are on that end supporting, if you want to help hold this piece tight against the fence, that's good. But I've had people help me catch before, and they think they're helping out a lot by pulling it. What they're really doing is they're pulling it away from the fence, so it's making my board crooked. So anyway, basically, you're there to support. You can hold the board tight against the fence. You can pull the scrap piece out with as long as you stay out, out of the safety margin, but you're not pulling the board through. Number 6, if the saw stalls, hold the workpiece and turn it on. Now, we don't have the saw stall very often, but there are some times where you're trying to run your board through and it doesn't go through for whatever reason. One of the biggest reasons that happens is maybe you didn't set your blade up high enough, and so while you're running this through, it didn't actually cut all the way through part of your board, and so now it's going to be buttoned up against the guard, so it won't let you shove it. Well, the point of this is don't freak out and just let go of it, because it's going to want to send it right back. You're going to hang on to it, shut it off, wait for it to stop, and then you can pull your board out and see what you need. That's probably the biggest thing that happens. Maybe you do have your blade set to the right height, but while you're cutting this, you accidentally pop a little bit of a wheelie right here. And so there's one little section that it didn't cut through. And so now it's not going through. Now, every now and then we have a board with maybe some irregular grain. Maybe it's got a knot or something crazy. And so while you're cutting it, that board actually starts pinching on the guard, on the splitter back there. And if that happens, you will have trouble, running it through. And so you might consider that a stall. And we don't want to be shoving it really, really hard. So you'll hang on to it, shut it off, wait for it to stop, and then we'll pull it out. Number 7. Always use a splitter guard when making a rip cut. Okay, our guard, I think the more technical term for this is a riving knife, but our guard, when we put this in there, it's going to have a splitter that keeps this wood separate from this wood. That keeps it from pinching on the blade and coming flying back at you. A lot of people don't realize, but the cutting your finger off is only like the second highest risk on the table saw. The bigger risk is actually a kickback. If we're doing a little skinny piece like that 1/2 inch piece I said, we'll put this riving knife in there, or I call it a splitter, but we'll put that in there, and that's just going to keep those two separate from pinching on the blade. All right, use a push stick when ripping narrow stock. That'd be any stock that you can't push it through without your hand being 4 inches from the blade. Okay, so if your hand's going to be within 4 inches, so if I can cut a 5-inch piece and just have my hand here, I don't really need a push stick. But if my hand's going to be over here on a 5-inch piece, then I need one. All right, number 9, never try to back out of a cut on the table saw. So we just really can't back out while the blade's spinning, because now we're traveling the same direction as the blade. So if you need to back up, shut it off, wait for it to stop, keep holding your piece, and then once that's done moving, then you can pull it out. Okay, the minimum stock length on the table saw is 12 inches. So that means the shortest board we can run through there safely is 12 inches. I've seen people try and cut a board like this. That's really stupid. That's dumb. I don't know why you'd ever do that. That's why I'm showing you. Don't do that. There's probably several bad things, but just at a minimum, that's not 12 inches, so we can't run that through there. So if you need to cut a board like this, go over to the miter saw. 11. Push on the stock that is nearest the fence when ripping. Okay, so when I'm ripping this board through here, let me use this board as an example. I'm pushing this board through here. I don't really care about this piece. It's not going to do anything dangerous. The part that's going to be dangerous is this piece coming flying back at me, the piece between the fence and the blade. So I'm always going to push on the stock that's nearest the fence. Now, when we're doing that, you don't really want your push stick right next to the fence, because that can make your board actually kind of turn into the blade. So I try and get my push stick out into the field a little bit, and actually while I'm pushing it forward, I'm also kind of pushing it against the fence so it doesn't steer the other way. So kind of at an angle there. But always push on the stock that's nearest the fence. All right, number 12. This is one we don't do very often, but it requires some of the most explanation. But we're going to use a clearance block when using the miter gauge with the rip fence. So here's my scenario. I need to make a bunch of little blocks that are 4 inches long. So I think to myself, just set that fence up to 4 inches, and then you can use the miter gauge, and you can just butt this up against the fence and make your cut, and butt the next one up and make your cut and just cut a bunch of blocks. Well, that is pretty genius. That might work. Except that when this block here gets cut off, it's sandwiched between the fence and the blade, and the blade's spinning, and so it's just going to take that block and just throw it. Seen it 1,000 times. Okay. Whenever we can, we want to make a little cut like this on the miter saw. That's going to be a way safer way to do it. But if we do need to make multiple cuts like this, it does make sense to use this method, but there's danger there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use what they call a clearance block, and that's going to give this board some clearance so it's not tight against the fence and the blade. So I'm just, for this example, I'm going to pretend this is my clearance block. So what I'm going to do, I said I want that 4 inches. I'm going to put this board here temporarily, and I'm going to measure 4 inches. Okay, so it's not 4 inches on here. It's basically 4 inches plus this board. Now, once I have that done, I would clamp this board in place. Which I'm not going to, yeah, I'll clamp it real quick. All right, now I'll make that cut. I'm going to go ahead and run this thing. So I'm going to butt it up. And I can cut pieces all day long like that, and nothing bad is ever going to happen because there's clearance. They're not sandwiched up against there. But if that fence was tight and that was in there, that piece is flying back. Okay, that's a clearance block. So whenever we use the miter gauge, which is this is the miter gauge, with the fence, we need a clearance block. Make sure that the blade will clear the saw table or any jigs or fixtures when making special cuts, such as when the blade is tilted. So when we have our blade tilted, we're going to make sure we're not actually cutting into something we shouldn't be. Number 14, get permission before making any type of cut that's out of the ordinary, which would be, our ripping or cross-cutting. Number 15, get instructor supervision before making any cut where the workpiece is lowered onto the blade. Typically, when we're lowering a piece onto the blade, we're making what is known as a blind dado. And that's where we have a dado, but on the front of the project, we don't want it to show. We don't want anybody to know it's a dado. So I'll cover that when we get to it. I'm just going to take some time and show you a few things on here. Okay, talked about our miter gauge. Okay, I'm going to show you how to set this guard in here. There's a little metal thing right here. We're going to pull this open, and then we can pull this out. And it kind of slides in there, and so it doesn't sit on top. So when you put it back in, if you notice this is sitting up higher, it means it didn't slide in the way it's supposed to. So it kind of slides in when we put it back. To put the guard in, or to take it out, we're going to pull this lever up right here, and that opens up this little slot, and this thing just fits in here. Then we push that down in there, and then we lock that lever back down. Okay, it's that easy. So I'll show you that one more time. Lever comes up, slip that in that little slot, lever goes down. Oh, this thing's real loose. I'm gonna have to tighten that before we do anything. And then we'd put this thing back in there, just like that. Okay, I'm gonna make a few rips. Generally, when we're ripping, we're trying to do a couple different things. Like this board, for example, I may be just trying to get rid of the bad edge on here. So I'd measure it and figure out, this is 1 15/16, and it's about 1 7/8. So I'd set it to the smallest number and rip it just so then that edge would be even. Sometimes I'm ripping it to a specific size. So it depends on what you're making. If you're making face frame pieces, Normally we'll rip those a 1/16 of an inch over. So if all your pieces are supposed to be 1.5 inches, we'll rip those to 1 9/16, and that allows us a little extra room to go ahead and sand those saw marks off of there. But for right now, I'm just going to show you how to operate this. So I'm going to set this up to 3.5. I get my board ready. I go ahead and make sure I have a push stick handy so I'm not having to search for that in the middle of the cut. And then my left hand is just going to push this tight against the fence. It's not really pushing in here at all. It's just holding it against the fence. And my right hand is going to be doing the pushing. Now, once I run out of room with the right hand, then I'm going to get on there with the push stick and push it the rest of the way through. A short board like this, sometimes we run the risk of getting on there with the push stick too early. And then when we're pushing, instead of pushing forward, we push down, which makes it pop a wheelie, and your board can kind of chatter on there. It'll scare you. You'll be like, it actually kind of smacks, start slapping it down. And the key is we want to be pushing down a little bit with our left hand while we're holding it tight against the fence, and then we don't want too much downward pressure here. That way it stays flat. I run this a few times. I'm going to hang on to it with the left hand and then get my push stick. Then I get rid of my left hand. Okay, we're never going to worry about that little scrap piece in there. It's never going to be dangerous enough to risk our fingers to reach in there and try and get it. Okay, I don't even really like you reaching across the blade to pull it out while the blade's spinning. It's every now and then this piece will actually fall down in there and make some commotion, but for the most part, this piece is never going to do anything. All the danger is happening here with the board that's trapped between the fence and the blade. Okay, I'm going to make one more cut. Like this board here, let's pretend I'm going to glue this up. It's going to be a panel, and I don't want to have this part in the part of the panel. I want to get rid of this. Well, some people think I'll just set the fence to a 1/2 inch or whatever this is, and then run through like that. Well, that's fairly dangerous. We don't have as much room to push. We have to get rid of the guard. So if you have to get rid of something on the edge of the board like that, your best bet is just going to be to measure to that spot. So that's about 5 3/4, and then we'll get rid of that. So I'm going to set this to 5 3/4. Oh yeah. And I push that board all the way through, and then I bring my push stick back on this side. I feel like that covers ripping. Another kind of cutting we do on here a lot is cross cutting. And so in order to do that, I'm going to get the fence out of my way. I'm going to pull this little throat plate out, get rid of the old guard, put this little guy back in, and then we use this cross-cutting sled. Okay, now keep in mind, anytime we cross-cut, we need to cut both ends because this is rough length, so that means it's 1 inch longer, and we don't trust these being square. So whenever we cross-cut, we got to recut both ends. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to square up one end. So I'm going to put it, where it's going to cut a little bit off. I'm going to pull this tight against the fence of the sled and then push it through. Okay, once again, we never care about that scrap over there. It's never more dangerous than it would be for us to reach over and try and pick that out of there while the blade's spinning. Okay, so make your cut, and then we pull that back. And then if we have a lot of multiple pieces to do, I do like to use the fence sometimes, which I know is confusing because, well, what about our clearance block? Well, what we'll do is, if I have a bunch of, say, 18s to do, I'll go ahead and butt them up, and then I'll put a clamp I'll clamp that to the fence. That way, as I push that, I know there's no way it can twist or anything like that and come flying back at me. If it's a really wide, now pretty much anytime we're sandwiching against the fence, we either need to use that clearance block or we need to have it clamped. That's the only way to do it. Over here, if it moves, it's not going to be a good cut, but it's not going to be unsafe necessarily. So this is kind of our end where we really got to watch that. I'm also going to show you a dado. Okay, I do want to mention that we use this saw for dados. I mean, we can do other stuff with it, but primarily we're cutting dados with it. And so what that means is we're basically going to stack blades together to get the width that we want. And we're not going to be cutting all the way through. We're just making it basically a little channel in there. So we'd set our fence up. Now we can't use the measure, the little tape measure that's on the fence, because the blade's a different thickness, so it's not accurate. So we really have to measure off of the fence, one side or the other of the blade, and get our piece set up. To turn this one on, we're just going to hit the green button, and then we'll push our piece through. And then push the red button to stop it.